The clock on the wall ticked loudly, echoing in the suffocating silence of the boardroom. Edward Collins felt the weight of 1,000 eyes pressing down on him. The Japanese investors across the table were exchanging confused glances, their polite smiles slowly fading. Sweat rolled down Edward's temples as he tried, once again, to make sense of what they were saying. He forced a laugh, dry, nervous. Yes, I understand, he lied, his voice trembling. But he didn't understand. Not a word. One of the investors slid a document across the table, saying something in Japanese that Edward couldn't decipher. His assistant fumbled with an online translator on her phone, but the robotic voice that came out only made things worse. The atmosphere cracked like ice. Millions of dollars. His reputation. Years of work. All of it was about to collapse, not because of a bad deal, but because no one in the room could understand each other. Then, suddenly, the door creaked open. A woman in a gray janitor's uniform stepped in, holding a mop. Everyone turned toward her, stunned. "Sir," she said softly, her eyes calm but determined. "I think I can help." No one could have imagined that, in that single moment, everything was about to change. If you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in people who still step up when the world turns away, take a moment to like, comment, and share this video. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you're about to see will restore your faith in humanity. We'd love to know, where you watching from? Comment below with your country and region, and let us celebrate the kindness that connects us all. Let's begin. It was a bright, crisp morning in downtown Chicago. The Collins Business Tower, a gleaming skyscraper of steel and glass, stood tall against the sunlight. Inside, the air buzzed with energy. Assistants hurried across the marble floors, secretaries carried stacks of documents. The faint aroma of expensive coffee lingered in the halls. At the top floor, Edward Collins, CEO and founder of Collins Enterprises, was in his element. Tall, perfectly groomed, and always wearing tailored suits, Edward had built his empire from nothing. He prided himself on control over people, over numbers, over every variable life could throw his way. "Everything has to go perfectly," he said, glancing at his assistant, Laura Benson, who was nervously checking her tablet. "Yes, sir. The investors from Tokyo will arrive in 20 minutes. "Excellent," Edward replied. "Have the presentation ready. And make sure the press team knows we'll make a statement after the signing." It was supposed to be the biggest deal of his career, a multimillion-dollar partnership with one of Japan's most prestigious tech conglomerates. The agreement would expand Collins Enterprises into the Asian market. The success of the deal meant recognition, power, and legacy. But one crucial piece of the puzzle was missing. The translator. "Where's our interpreter?" Edward asked, checking his watch. "He should be here any minute," Laura stammered. "His flight landed this morning." Edward frowned. "Fine. We'll start without him. I'm sure they speak English." He said it with the same arrogance that had carried him through years of business victories. But arrogance, that day, would be his downfall. When the black diplomatic sedans pulled up in front of the tower, tension rippled through the staff. The investors, 3 impeccably dressed Japanese businessmen, stepped out, bowing respectfully. Edward met them at the entrance, all smiles and confidence. "Welcome to Collins Enterprises," he said loudly, his British accent heavy and formal. "It's an honor to have you here." The guests nodded politely, their expressions unreadable. Inside, everyone followed them toward the grand conference room. The cameras were already set up. The press waited outside the glass doors. Every second was choreographed, except for one missing man who could bridge the languages. As the meeting began, Edward did his best to improvise. He spoke slowly, pointing at charts and graphs on the screen. The Japanese investors listened attentively, but confusion grew with every minute. When they responded, their English was limited and heavily accented. Edward nodded, pretending to understand, his pride forbidding him from admitting the truth. Laura typed desperately on an online translation app, holding her phone toward him. The robotic voice said something incomprehensible that made one of the investors raise an eyebrow. Another whispered something in Japanese to his colleagues, and Edward's stomach twisted. Laughter. Not cruel, but quiet, polite, uncomfortable laughter. Edward's throat tightened. His face flushed red. His hand trembled as he tried to speak again. "I understand. We can finalize the agreement today," he said, gesturing wildly toward the contract. The lead investor glanced at his partners, murmuring something softly. Then, one of them stood up. The air froze. Edward's heart dropped. The investors were about to leave. Outside the boardroom, staff members whispered among themselves. Everyone could feel the disaster unfolding behind those glass walls. Down the corridor, Sarah Miller, the janitor assigned to the executive floor, was mopping the polished floor tiles. She was in her early 40s, modestly dressed, with tired hands and a calm, kind face. She had worked in that building for years, invisible to those she cleaned up after. But that morning, she couldn't help overhearing the muffled voices from the conference room, the rising tension, the failed attempts to communicate. She paused, leaning on her mop. Years earlier, Sarah had worked at an international hotel in Los Angeles, where she picked up basic Japanese from the tourists she served. She'd always loved learning languages, though life had forced her to give up school early. As she listened, her heart began to race. She could understand fragments, simple words, phrases of confusion. She realized what was happening. They were misunderstanding each other. Completely. And if someone didn't help, Edward Collins, the untouchable man on the top floor, was about to lose everything. She hesitated. What would they say if a janitor dared to interrupt a millionaire's meeting? Her instincts screamed for her to stay quiet, but something stronger pushed her forward, something human. She took a deep breath, set the mop against the wall, and walked to the door. Sarah knocked gently. The guards at the door moved to stop her. I think I can help," she said softly. "Ma'am, this is a private meeting," one guard muttered. But her tone grew firmer. "Please. I understand what they're saying. Let me help." Inside, heads turned. Edward looked toward the door, his patience already shattered. "What is this?" he barked. But then the investors looked up, curious, when Sarah spoke a few hesitant words in Japanese. The room froze. The businessmen exchanged surprised glances. One of them responded to her, testing. She replied fluently enough to make him smile. It was as if the clouds broke and light poured in. Edward blinked, astonished. "Wait, you understand them?" Sarah nodded, nervous but composed. "A little, sir. Enough to translate." Against all logic, Edward gestured for her to come in. And in that instant, everything began to change. Standing before a table of millionaires, Sarah straightened her shoulders. She translated each sentence carefully, the investors' polite requests, their questions about the proposal, their concerns about logistics. Her tone was calm, clear, and respectful. For the first time all morning, communication flowed like water. Edward watched in disbelief. The woman who cleaned his floors every night was now saving his reputation, his contract, his empire. The investors began to smile. They nodded, relaxed, and even laughed at moments. The tension dissolved, replaced by warmth and cooperation. Every time Sarah spoke, she built a bridge where moments before there had been a wall. Edward felt something break inside him. Not humiliation, but humility. When the meeting ended, the Japanese investors stood and applauded her. One even bowed and asked for a photo together. The contract was signed. The deal was saved. And the janitor had become the hero no one expected. When the crowd dispersed, the room fell silent again. Only Edward and Sarah remained. He stood there, still trying to process what had just happened. His hands were trembling slightly. "Sarah," he said at last, his voice quiet, "I don't even know how to thank you." She lowered her eyes, modest as ever. "I just did what I thought was right, sir." We all have something to offer, even if no one sees it. Her words pierced through him like an arrow, gentle, but powerful. For the first time in his life, Edward Collins, the man who believed he could buy respect, felt small in the presence of true greatness. When she left the room, her footsteps faded softly, but the silence she left behind felt sacred. Something inside him had shifted forever. A week later, the main auditorium of Collins Enterprises was packed. Reporters, employees, and executives gathered for the company's monthly address. Cameras flashed. Edward walked to the podium, but this time his confidence had changed. It was no longer arrogance. It was humility. "Today," he began, "I want to introduce someone who reminded me, and all of us, what it truly means to be human." The crowd grew silent. He looked toward the back, where Sarah stood nervously, still in her janitor's uniform. "This woman didn't just translate words," he continued. "She translated values. She reminded us that empathy can save even the coldest business." The applause began softly, then grew louder. Some people wiped tears. Others smiled with pride. Sarah blushed, overwhelmed, as Edward invited her to the stage. Under the warm lights, her eyes glistened. She had never imagined that a single act of kindness could ripple through so many lives. A few days later, Edward called her into his office. On his desk was a sealed envelope with her name written neatly across it. "Sarah," he said, "I've decided to offer you a scholarship to study languages and a new position in our international relations department." Her mouth fell open. "Sir, I don't know what to say." He smiled, genuinely this time. "Just say yes. Talent doesn't wear a uniform." The cameras flashed again as he handed her the envelope. The photo would later spread across newspapers and social media. The janitor who saved $1 million deal. Sarah's story went viral. Interviews, articles, and television appearances followed. She always said the same thing. "I only did what anyone should do." She became a symbol of humility and determination, inspiring countless people who felt invisible in their workplaces. Edward, meanwhile, was never the same. He stopped measuring success in profits and started valuing people. He spent more time listening, mentoring, and building relationships. For the first time, he saw the humanity behind every name on his payroll. He learned that leadership isn't about commanding, it's about understanding. Months later, Sarah stood before a group of young interns at Collins Enterprises, teaching them the basics of cross-cultural communication. Her office now had a window view of the city skyline, the same skyline she used to see only while mopping the floors. She still kept her old janitor's badge in a drawer. Not as a reminder of where she'd been, but of the moment she realized that dignity doesn't come from titles. It comes from courage. Edward often visited her office, just to talk. Their friendship became a quiet testament to everything they had learned from that fateful day. Because sometimes, life's greatest lessons don't come from those in power, they come from those who dare to speak when no one else will. And in the end, both Edward and Sarah understood something profound. That no matter our language, our status, or our past, we all share one universal voice, the language of the heart. Which part of this story touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to read them. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, so you won't miss any of our next emotional stories.